Tom Nichols visiting with 4th District Congressman Bruce Westerman. Bruce, it's always good to see you.
Hey, it's always good to be here, Tom. Good to be on KVRE talking to your wide audience of listeners. I know it's here in Hot Springs Village, but I know your reach is far and wide.
That's right. Now that we're broadcasting nationwide on the internet, KVRE.com.
Yeah.
You guys in Washington can listen to us.
Yeah, but all over the world.
Yeah,
all you need is an internet connection, and you can have it live.
Let's talk about this recent Omnibus bill. You voted against it.
I did, and I think the voters in the 4th District that sent me to Washington, D.C. would expect no less. The irony in that, Tom, is there was some forestry legislation that I've worked on since I've been in Congress that got put into that omnibus bill. So I voted against something that had something in there that I really liked. And there was other good stuff in it, but it's insane that we get in these crisis situations where you got a looming government shutdown that could totally be avoided. But these situations are created, and then you get a 2,200-page bill that nobody knows what's in it. I mean, there's multiple people working multiple angles to get everything in the bill, and I doubt there's one person still that knows everything that was in that bill. So we get it. I've heard it said that if somebody's done the math on it, if you'd started reading it the minute it was filed and read right up until time to vote, you'd had to have read 132 pages per hour just to read through it. And if you've ever read federal legislation, you can read through it and not know what you read because the way it's written, you have to have the code and read the context of what's in existing code with the new language that's going in it. So it was impossible. I've got a friend who's actually a speed reader in Congress. He couldn't even get through the entire bill. About 2:00 in the morning, I couldn't focus on the pages anymore, and I said, that's enough for me. I know how I'm voting on this bill. But it increases the deficit nearly $1 trillion. We've already got about a $21 trillion debt, and maybe I'm an oddball, but to me that's serious stuff, and we've got to start addressing those issues. And to give the House credit, we passed all 12 appropriation bills, had them in the Senate last September before the end of the fiscal year. And
that's the way it's supposed to be done.
That's regular order, yeah.
Yes. And it hasn't been done like that in years.
No, and the Senate has yet to take up a single one of those appropriation bills. You have these continuing resolutions to keep the government from shutting down, so you create this deadline. You get right up to the deadline, and there was another continuing resolution. And then all of a sudden, you've got this, you're in March. The fiscal year ended last September, and you're approving the budget for the year you're already in. That is not how I think our founders intended for the government to work.
Well, representative democracy, where you guys represent the voters, because the voters can't be there, so we send our elected representatives there. But this thing was put together, and they must have been working on it for some time, but it was the product of the Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell, House Speaker Paul Ryan, Senate Minority Leader Nancy Pelosi, and the
House Minority Leader Pelosi and Schumer in the Senate.
Leader Schumer in the Senate. Yeah. But they put it together.
Yeah, with staff and
nobody else had a chance to look at it or have any input.
Yeah, we had 15, 17 hours.
Yeah.
And that's not the way it's supposed to work. It happens because of the 60-vote rule in the Senate.
Right.
And constitutionally, Congress is supposed to fund the government. They shouldn't be using that 60-vote rule, which has a purpose. The cloture rule has a purpose on major policy issues and changes, but when they're preventing appropriation bills from coming up for debate in the Senate, that is, to me, gross abuse of the rule. And I really wish the Senate would change that on spending bills, where they could bring up a spending bill and debate it without having to have 60 votes. Because what you get are 8 to 10 Democratic senators holding the entire country hostage. They're saying, okay, we will vote for cloture, but we've got to have this, this, and this.
They're running the show.
Yeah, they literally are driving. Yeah. So who's got the most power in the Senate, the majority or the minority?
Yeah. And yet,
and it's the majority's fault because the majority can change the rule with a simple majority vote.
Mitch McConnell is establishment, and there are a number of other senators that have been there a long time that don't want to change it. But the filibuster rule is not in the Constitution.
No, it's got a long history. It's been around a long time, and it's been changed over the years. Used to, they had to go hold the floor, and you had to have the votes not to go or not to allow cloture. Now they don't even have to vote. If they know they haven't got the 60 votes, they never vote. So nobody's ever on record to show who's preventing the bills from coming to the floor. And man, I wish they would change that rule. And it reflects poorly on all of Congress and what we're doing in the House, where we've passed over 400 bills in the House, and very rarely do they get even brought up for debate. So this omnibus bill, a lot of people think of it as a spending bill, but it's really an all-inclusive bill. It had tons of policy jammed in it. I mean, the law was changed in a lot of different areas in this must-pass spending bill. So, I'm going to continue fighting and working hard to change the process. We're somewhat limited because, the House is a co-equal branch of the legislature, and we have really no say on what the Senate does. But the Senate minority is driving the discussion and the policy in D.C.
Yeah. My solution in the Senate is to make Tom Cotton the majority leader.
I would vote for that, but I don't have a vote.
Let's start the drive right now. But he voted against it too. But this was exactly the same thing. The frustrating thing is this is exactly the same thing in the same way that Nancy Pelosi got Obamacare passed. We have to pass it to know what's in it. And it's strictly against the way the Founding Fathers set up the country. And here it is again. It was a nightmare.
Yeah, and if you look at all the details on that, the Democrats had 60 votes in the Senate when they passed Obamacare on Christmas Eve.
Yeah.
And if you remember, they wanted to rush it through and get it passed, and not knowing what was in it, they thought they would come back through and change it in the next Congress. Well, that's when Scott Brown got elected to Congress, and it took their 60-vote majority away. So you had, or their supermajority, if you will. So they weren't ever able to go back and do a lot of the stuff they were trying to do in Obamacare. Right. But yeah, it's the same playbook.
Well, let's talk about your legislation that was finally passed by, you could never get yours passed by the Senate. You always passed it in the House on the forestry thing.
Yeah, we passed it twice as a standalone bill, and we amended it into the energy bill another time in the House. But
what's it going to do?
Not only could we not get it passed, they never had a hearing on it. Not one single hearing in any Senate committee on the legislation, while we saw 10 million acres of forest land burn up last year, and the Forest Service spent about $3 billion or more fighting fires. And they didn't even have a hearing on it. But in this omnibus, there were components of the forestry bill shoved into the omnibus. And those were law changes. It wasn't about spending; it was about changing the law, and it just created some more tools for the Forest Service to not have to do what's called fire borrowing, where the money to fight the fires comes out of the Forest Service's budget. And you think about the fiscal years, October 1st to September 30th. Well, as the fiscal year is ending, that's when fire season's at its peak. So the Forest Service sandbags their money all year long to save it so they can have money to fight the fire. So they never do any management activities the whole year, and they save all their money to try to spend it on fires. So we fixed that so that they can do the management activities, and if they don't have the money to pay for the firefighting, then the money comes out of FEMA, which at the end of the day, I always say, how much money is the Forest Service or is the federal government going to spend to fight fires? It's however much it costs to fight fires. Because when these fires are burning, you're going to send the firefighters in, and you're going to worry about paying for it later.
There's no way to know how many you're going to have to fight.
Yeah, so this gives you a way to plan up front and to do your management activities that will actually reduce the amount of forest fires in the long run. And they got some a secure rural schools program that provides funding to rural counties that have been affected because you're not harvesting timber anymore. You know, in 1989, the Forest Service generated a $1.4 billion, nearly $1.5 billion in timber sales across the country. In 2016, it was $162 million. And we've seen poverty levels increase in rural communities. If you look here in Arkansas, Scott County's 87% U.S. Forest Service. You can't tax that federal land. You can't collect property taxes off of it. So your land base to collect property taxes to fund schools and to fund emergency services and road systems is basically non-existent. So
Montgomery County is 80% in the national forest.
yeah, they're the second. Scott County and Montgomery County are the two largest national forest counties in my district, and actually in the state, I believe. So those communities hurt when you can't get revenue off of the forest. So the federal government stepped in with a Band-Aid called Secure Rural Schools, and then PILT, payment in lieu of taxes, which is really unnecessary because if you were managing the forest to be healthy, you would be generating the revenue that would help fund these rural communities. So there's another 2-year Band-Aid on Secure Rural Schools in there. But there's also some tools to help them manage. There's something called a categorical exclusion for in 3,000-acre blocks to reduce hazardous fuels. There's a program for a 20-year stewardship contracting, which that would be if you were an industry wanting to build a facility and you needed fiber for your facility. Right now, you can get a 10-year contract from the Forest Service. Well, financially, that doesn't work. You need something longer to take to the bank to say, we're going to build this $100 million facility, and we're going to make this product, and we've got this resource secured for 20 years. You know, the financials work out on it like that much better. And some other odds and end things that were in the Resilient Federal Forest Act that got put into this omnibus bill that are good things. They're by no means everything we had in the forestry bill, but again, it shows you how confused and chaotic and dysfunctional Congress is when I've got something I've worked on 3 years that gets into a bill and I end up voting against it because of all the other baggage that's tied onto it. We should be voting on one issue at a time.
Right.
And that's the way it's set up. We pass a bill out of the House, they pass it out of the Senate, we get together and work out our differences, and it goes to the president's desk. That's the way it's supposed to happen.
We have a few minutes left. What about the border? What's your position on that?
Yeah, and I'm not sure if I've talked to you since I made a trip down to the border, but I spent a couple of days with the Border Patrol down in Arizona. It was quite an eye-opening experience. We could probably do a 1-hour show on that. But the thing I took away from it is no matter how bad you think the drug problem is in our country, it's worse. There are drug cartels operating on the U.S. side of the border. They hide out in the mountains with spotters. We flew over in helicopters, and you could see their solar panels they use to charge their phones and their radios. They're watching for where the Border Patrol moves so they can radio down to the coyotes and the mules that are smuggling drugs and people.
And that open border is a gateway to it. No border, no country, basically. But
yeah,
there's so much resistance to that I don't understand.
Yeah, we need to secure the border. And there's, in places it's a strand of barbed wire, and other places it's called a Normandy fence that you could crawl under it easily. But the worst thing is there's no road access because a lot of this land is federal land, and it's like a wilderness area or a national monument, and the Wilderness Act rules and all that don't allow you to put roads in there. So the Border Patrol's at a great disadvantage. They either have to walk in, ride a horse, or get dropped in by helicopter.
Yeah. Well, we need to pay attention to it because it's national security.
Yeah, and I see where the president's talking about using the National Guard. My take, after flying over and seeing where these drug cartels were operating on our side of the border, this isn't an issue the Border Patrol needs to be dealing with. It's an issue the U.S. military needs to be dealing with. We've got foreign illegal operators on U.S. soil doing things that are damaging to our country. Good. And I have no pity for them.
We'll have to leave it there. Congressman Bruce Westerman.
Thanks, Tom.